Thank you, Jim Lakely, James Taylor, Tim, and everyone else at Heartland Institute for putting this panel together. My name is Kevin Diaratna. I'm the Principal Statistician, Research Fellow, and Data Scientist at the Heritage Foundation Center for Data Analysis, and I'm going to talk about the social benefits of luke warming. So before we get into this, I first want us to go back and think about the 2000s. What do we remember about the 2000s? First, obviously there was a contentious election of 2000, major tax reform, sadly 9/11. There was also, from the non-policy side, the proliferation of social media like Facebook, Twitter, and MySpace, and the obsolescence of VHS tapes to be replaced with DVDs, among many other things. But there are some things that never change. Namely, here is a report, an article from The Guardian about a report that President George W. Bush was briefed on from the Pentagon in 2004. He was told by the Pentagon, by this research from the Pentagon, that climate change over the next 20 years could result in global catastrophe costing millions of lives in wars and natural disasters. By 2020, European cities would be sunk beneath rising seas. The report said Britain would be plunged into a Siberian climate, nuclear conflict, mega droughts, famine, and widespread rioting would erupt all across the world. Abrupt climate change could bring the planet to the edge of anarchy as countries develop a nuclear threat to defend and secure dwindling food, water, and energy supplies. Now, it's been 17 years. How have these predictions panned out? Well, to be quite honest, up until this pandemic, the American economy was booming. And obviously, the planet has warmed, but not nearly to the extent that these people claimed it would. To use a phrase coined by my good friend Pat Michaels, the planet has lukewarmed. So now predictions about climate change continue to be published, and it is important to be able to accurately evaluate them. So there are a bunch of fundamentally important questions to ask. How would one go about engaging in an honest cost-benefit analysis of CO2 emissions? And the Biden administration is attempting to answer this question. So one tool for doing this is the so-called social cost of carbon. It is based on a construct of research in climate economics. It has been used as a basis for regulatory policy by the Biden administration's interagency working group and is defined as the economic damages per metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions summed across a particular time horizon. So what is the history of the SCC? It was proposed years ago as a basis for regulatory policy by the Obama administration's interagency working group. President Trump initially rescinded its use and brought it back, and the Biden administration is looking to bring it back after particularly the Obama administration's use of the SCC, like they did in the early 2010s. Now, they're apparently in the process of updating these estimates, and we'll see what they come up with. But we actually have analyzed these models in-house at the Heritage Foundation Center for Data Analysis. So I'm going to actually get into that here a little bit. So firstly, a good question is, how does one actually estimate the SCC? The general question becomes, what is the long-term economic impact of carbon dioxide emissions summed across a particular time horizon? There are three main statistical models used for getting at this question: the DICE model, the FUN model, and the PAGE model. Each of these equations represents economic growth and climate each of these models, represents economic growth and climate response, and is represented by a series of equations, and they're modeled by what us statisticians refer to as Monte Carlo analysis. The idea is that various components of these models are random, and therefore they are repeatedly estimated, and as a result of this repeated estimation, distributions of the social cost of carbon are reported, and summary statistics such as means, standard deviations, confidence intervals can be reported. So what we have right here, and this is from the Obama administration's technical support document from 2010, are the damage functions for the three models. The red is DICE, the blue is PAGE, and the green is FUN. And the x-axis is temperature change, and the y-axis is loss per unit of global GDP. So these are really the meat that go into, some of the meat that go into these IAMs. Now, if you look at the green curve, you could see between 0 and 3 degrees, it actually goes below the y-axis. Below 0, on the y-axis. And if you zoom in, you could see this negativity. So what does that tell us? Interestingly, it tells us that the fund model can exhibit negative losses, meaning that under certain circumstances, namely a lukewarming planet, the benefits of CO2 emissions can actually outweigh the costs. Now, these are part of the assumptions that go into this model. These models are grounded by assumptions. I have studied this significantly, both at Heritage, published at Heritage and in the peer-reviewed literature. I've testified in front of Congress and state governments about this as well. These models are grounded by assumptions, namely the specification of a discount rate, the specification of a time horizon, and specification of what we call an equilibrium climate sensitivity, or ECS distribution. We've published extensively. I've had the staff here bring these papers. They should be available at this conference for you to pick up. So anyway, I've published extensively on these issues, and we're going to get into a very specific set of assumptions in this talk, because there are many, 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 many other assumptions as well in these models. Here is one, the agricultural productivity component. As everybody in this room and this conference would realize, CO2, or carbon dioxide, is a fundamental component of photosynthesis. The CO2 fertilization effects in fund are based on research mostly from the 1990s. Here are two papers, Kane et al. 1992 and Segas et al. 1997, which document the impact of CO2 emissions on agricultural output and the fertilization effects. I don't want to get too much into the mathematics here, but the CO2 fertilization effect in fund is modeled by this equation. A sub r equals gamma sub r times the natural log of the CO2 concentration at a particular time divided by 275. And gamma sub r is a coefficient that models agricultural productivity, and it is an a priori specified assumption in the fund model. So let's think about this assumption, and particularly, like I said, this research, much of this research is from the 90s. So what happens if you look at the more recent research? Well, there is a significant body of research on rice yields. Rice yields have been shown to exhibit strong positive responses to enhance ambient CO2 levels. A number of studies, Challenor et al. 2014, Zhu et al. 2015, and Wu et al. 2018, all report evidence that hybrid rice varietals exist that are more heat tolerant and therefore able to take advantage of CO2 enrichment even under warming conditions. Here is a plot from another piece of research. This paper was published in the journal Nature by Zhu et al. 2016. And here are trends in average observed leaf area index. Obviously, throughout the world, you see different shades. And the areas that are benefiting the most are the tropics, the deserts, as you can see here. And the reason I present this plot is it is fundamentally important. I want to emphasize that when you see something like this, it is fundamentally important if we are going to engage in honest cost-benefit analysis to consider the benefits of CO2 emissions as well as the costs. So in terms of the agricultural productivity component, there's even more literature. The leaf area index, it has significant implications for agricultural output. Gao et al. 2018 reported that agricultural-related trends were more than double those of natural vegetation, indicating that trends in leaf area index are likely indicators of increased agricultural productivity. There is a meta-analysis conducted by Challenor et al. 2014 as well that show that under moderate warming, lukewarming, that there is a significant opportunity for plants to exhibit higher agricultural yields under moderate warming and CO2 enrichment. Here is another plot. Now, here we have time from 1980 up until the middle of last decade. And the y-axis is global crop production, the sum of maize, rice, soybeans, and wheat. And you can see, despite the warming, the lukewarming that we've seen, these things have increased. So what does this tell us? Altogether, this strongly suggests that the assumptions made in the fund model are understated, and it is perfectly reasonable to reevaluate the fund model, updating this agricultural productivity component, namely this coefficient right here, gamma sub r. So we did that in our research. We did that by increasing it by 15% and 30%. To see what the results would tell us. But in addition to that, we also examined the equilibrium climate-sensitive distribution. Now, global warming alarmists will tell you that the science has settled on global warming. But I've said this many times in talks. Settled science is, to me, an oxymoron. Because science is by definition unsettled, this is why we keep publishing research. ECS distributions are no different. Here are a bunch. The Rowe-Baker distribution, published in 2007, that was 14 years ago, is the distribution that the Obama administration's interagency working group had used. Since then, a variety of more up-to-date ECS distributions have been published, and you can see some of them right here. And we've examined these extensively in our prior research. Again, my papers are available at this conference. We will be distributing them. And the thing is that if you look at them, here are plots. This is actually from our paper. You look at this, so the equilibrium climate sensitivity quantifies the Earth's temperature to a doubling of CO2 emissions. That is, suppose CO2 emissions are to double. What would the Earth's temperature response be? Well, the dark gray curve represents the probabilistic response under the Rowe-Baker assumptions used by the Obama administration's interagency working group, and the areas under the curve demonstrate the probability. So you look at the area under the curve for, say, 3 degrees Celsius onwards. This unfortunately doesn't have a laser pointer, otherwise I'd show you. 3 degrees Celsius onwards. That gives you the probability that the Earth's temperature will warm by more than 3 degrees in response to a doubling of CO2 emissions. As you can see with the more up-to-date ECS distributions, that probability is still non-zero, but much, 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 much smaller. And this is where a lot of this alarming rhetoric comes from, this fat tail. At any rate, we have updated the integrated assessment modeling and the fund model using more up-to-date ECS distributions apart from this outdated distribution that the Obama administration's interagency working group had used. So what happens if we alter these assumptions? In particular, what happens if we tweak the agricultural productivity coefficient and the ECS distribution? And this work was published jointly with my colleagues Ross McKittrick, who's at the University of Guelph, and Pat Michaels, who is here, who's at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And we published this in the peer-reviewed journal, Environmental Economics and Policy Studies. And again, this paper is here for you guys to pick up. So this is what happens. So the x-axis is the year of the SCC, and the y-axis is the mean social cost of carbon, average across the Monte Carlo iterations. So you see under the outdated Rowe-Baker distribution, and this is what the Obama administration's interagency working group had published, assuming a 3% discount rate, you have an SCC between $19 and $27 a ton between 2020 and 2050. Now, what happens if we update the ECS distribution to Lewis and Curry 2018? Here you go. It plummets to $1 and $4 a ton. But now what happens if you take this lukewarming Lewis and Curry distribution, which may very well coincide with reality, and you increase the agricultural productivity coefficient by, say, 15%, which is perfectly in line with that literature that I had discussed earlier. There you go. Now it becomes interesting because the SCC starts to become negative, which is what I was alluding to earlier, between -1 and +1 a ton, depending on the year. But what if we increase the agricultural productivity coefficient by 30%? There you go. Between -$2.87 and -$1 per ton. So it's completely negative on average, even under a 3% discount rate. So now, how about under a 7% discount rate? And this discount rate, by the way, was intentionally ignored by the Obama administration's interagency working group. And when you use their outdated assumption of equilibrium climate sensitivity, the Rowe-Baker distribution, you can see why they ignored it, because it shows a $0 social cost of carbon. Now, the Lewis and Curry distribution, actually, in fact, in 2020, which is well after they had published these results, you actually have a slightly negative SCC, even using their outdated assumption. Anyway, under the Lewis and Curry distribution, it's even more negative, between -$1.25 a ton in 2020 through -66 a ton through 2050. How about if we update the agricultural productivity coefficient by 15%? There you go. It decreases even more, from -$2.06 to -$1.74 a ton. And lastly, Lewis and Curry 2018 with a 30% increase in agricultural productivity. Voila. This is between minus $2.84 a ton and minus $2.71 a ton. So it is, again, completely negative. And this is just a snapshot of our research. We have reported many more results than this under other assumptions as well in our papers, which you can pick up, like I said. So now, you saw this negativity here, and I want to come back to that. Here's a good question to ask. Is global warming necessarily a bad thing? That is, are there economic damages actually associated with CO2 emissions? Well, according to the FUN model, the answer is no, because you could actually see that under very reasonable assumptions, the benefits of CO2 emissions can actually outweigh the costs. So as I was alluding to earlier, we estimate these models via what we call Monte Carlo analysis. The idea is that various components of the model are random, so they're repeatedly estimated, so we can compute probabilities of a negative SCC, which, by the way, the Obama administration's interagency working group did not report. So, what is the probability of a negative social cost of carbon using the Obama administration's outdated assumptions of the Rowe-Baker distribution published in 2007? Here, you have around a 10% chance that the SCC will be negative. I wouldn't say that's trivial. But now, even using the 3% discount rate, what if you use the more up-to-date Lewis and Curry distribution that signifies a lukewarming planet? Voila. Between a 40% and a 50% chance that the SCC is negative. But it gets better. What if you increase the agricultural productivity coefficient by 15%? Oh, what happened? Oh, I went back, sorry. If you increase the agricultural productivity coefficient by 15%, here you go, it increases even more. Between 48% and a 57% chance that the SCC is negative, under a 3% discount rate. Now, how about under a 7% discount rate? There you go. Between 54% and a 63% chance that the SCC is negative. Now, this is under a 3% discount rate. Now, what if you use the 7% discount rate intentionally ignored by the Obama administration's interagency working group? And by the way, this 7% discount rate, this corresponds with the rate of return of the United States stock market over the last, say, 100 years. So using the outdated Rowe-Baker distribution, that under a 7% discount rate, you have between a 40% and 60% chance of the SCC being negative. So you really wonder why they ignored the 7% discount rate. Under the Lewis and Curry distribution, you have between a 56 and 71% chance of the SCC being negative. Now, what if you update the agricultural productivity coefficient by increasing it by 15%? There you go. Between 65 and 80% chance that the SCC may be negative. Now, what if you increase it by 30%? Well over 70%. So there you have it. So what does this tell us? Under very reasonable assumptions, does anybody in this room think these assumptions are not reasonable? Yeah, I didn't think so. Under very reasonable assumptions regarding agricultural productivity and moderate warming, the SCC may very well be negative, and we looked at much more about other assumptions in our papers, so this really signifies that it is quite possible that there are actually social benefits of lukewarming. So here's some advice for policymakers and the general public. I am not claiming, and my co-author is not claiming, that this is the value of the SCC because these models are so highly sensitive to assumptions. But this is what the SCC signifies under a very reasonable set of assumptions. And the Biden administration is using these same models, so I urge policymakers, you guys, and the general public to think seriously about the administration's estimates and the assumptions that go into producing them. And I want to emphasize it is absolutely urgent to urge lawmakers and the general public to think seriously about the assumptions going into these models, because if you don't, you may very well end up having lawmakers informed with research like this. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.